So what I've got here then is a base Mac Studio Ultra, the one with the 48 GPU cores. Now, just how fast are the media accelerators on this, specifically the ProRes ones, when exporting ProRes from DaVinci Resolve? Well, what I'm going to do is dive straight into a number of tests right now, and then I will come back after that and do a bit of boring talking about what exactly is going on. So the first thing that I'm going to show you then is which of my Macs I'm on. So if I click up here and go to About This Mac, as we can see here, this is the Apple M1 Ultra. And just to be clear, once again, this has only got the 48 GPU cores in it. However, for this particular type of test and encode, the GPU cores don't even come into play anyways. So let me get shut of that. Now let me just get into DaVinci Resolve. Let me go full screen. Now I'll show you a few things here before I get into the encoder, because it's going to be important that you see these things. So the media in the timeline here, as we can see, is 10 minutes long. Now bear in mind, this is 10 minutes long, okay? Now also, if we have a look at the inspector, it is telling us that this is ProRes 422 Proxy, 24 frames per second with a resolution of 1080. So basically 1080p 24. And if we have a quick look here at the project settings or the setup, this too is also 1080p 24 frames per second. And then ultimately, once we go into the encoder, it's going to be encoding at the same frame rate and the same resolution and such. So as we can see there, that is the basic setup for what is going on. Now what I'm going to do is go to the encoder. Now I've already conveniently set up my first name for the output, and that is 422 Proxy to 422 Proxy. And as we can see here, I've selected 422 Proxy for the output. And also, once again, it is 1080p and it is 24 and stuff. Now just quickly, if we come down here, as we can see, I have this thing unticked, and this says bypass re-encode when possible. This is actually very important for this particular test. Now, if you want to know exactly what that function does, check the description below, because I've actually done a video explaining what that function does in relation to ProRes for this type of exporting. Anyways, nonetheless, here we go. So I'm going to add that particular encode to the queue over here. Now I'm going to hit render all. Now look at this up here. Boom. Over 1000 frames per second. Okay. And I'm going to let this run through because it's going to be dead quick. So let's get to this end number over here for the time. And as we can see here, 14 seconds. So let's just kind of absorb that for a moment. This timeline is 10 minutes long and it exported in 14 seconds. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is set up another export. Okay, so as we can see here, I'm now going to go out to 422 HQ. I've given myself an appropriate name here, just something that I know to look for when I have to go deleting these files, because I'm going to start filling up my drive by the looks of it. Anyway, so add to render queue and render. Now watch this. There we go. Over 1000 frames per second. Once again, just insanely fast. Now, if we come over here, and we will get to the final time shortly, and the time for this is 14 seconds. Now let me just go and change to another output for ProRes. Okay, so as you can see here, I have now selected 4444XQ, and I have also given this an appropriate name as well. So let me just add that to the render queue, and I will hit render, and watch this. This too goes over 1000 frames per second. So insanely fast once again. So let me just let this get to the end and let's see what the time says here. And once again, 14 seconds. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go back to the timeline here. I'm going to flip these files around. So I'm going to put another 10-minute file here. And as we will see with this one, just to be clear, it is 10 minutes long, as we can see. Now, if I go and look at the inspector, this particular ProRes file is 4444XQ. Once again, 24 frames per second and 1080p and stuff and all the rest of it. So let me just shoot over here to the exporter. Now let me just change a couple of things here. Okay, so as we can see, I've now got this going out to ProRes 422 Proxy, and I've also given myself like an appropriate name, so that is 4444XQ to 422 Proxy. Let me just add that to the render queue and let me hit render. Let's have a look here, and boom, look at that. over 1,000 frames per second. Okay, let me just let this go through and let's get a timing on it. So we're nearly at the end here, and there we go. 14 seconds once again. Now let me just change these settings again. Okay, so I've now changed the export parameters to ProRes 422HQ. Give myself an appropriate name there as well. Let me add that to the queue, and then let me start the render. And once again, boom, over 1,000 frames per second. And I'm going to hazard a guess, this is probably going to be 14 seconds again. So let's just wait for this to go through, and there we go. 14 seconds. Now let me just change the settings again. Okay, so I've now changed the output to 4444XQ, once again giving myself an appropriate name. Let me add that to the render queue, and then let me hit render, and then we will very quickly see that this too is over 1,000 frames per second, which once again is just absolutely mental. So let me just get to the final output timing here, and once again 14 seconds. Okay, so now that I've done the exports, I'm now going to go into something that's even more boring than what the exports were, and that is to explain exactly what is going on here. Now, just before I get into talking about what we've just seen there and explaining some of the things that have gone on within that test, here's something that I think a lot of people are going to find very interesting. What I have here is an M1 Max MacBook Pro. Now, these have only got half of the accelerators for all the media encoding that the Ultra chips have got within inside these Mac Studios. However, that test you've just seen there runs at the exact same frame rate on the M1 Max as it does on the Ultra. So, in spite of the fact that the Ultra has actually got twice the amount of encoders and twice the amount of decoders and stuff like that, that particular test is exactly the same on both. In fact, the M1 Max is very, very slightly faster as well. Now, I will be doing a video soon which is going to compare those speeds between the Ultra and the M1 Max. So if you're into stuff like that, then definitely keep an eye on my channel. However, what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about the results that we've just seen and kind of like why these things are the way they are. Now, I'm not going to go into this in like any particular order. I'll kind of just ramble a bit about like, you know, what goes on with these types of encodes and whatnot. So basically, what I've done is to use ProRes in the timeline itself, and obviously two variations of ProRes there as well. Now, the reason for that is because what we want to do is to be able to feed into the video buffer as fast as possible the video that's in the timeline. And obviously in this instance, because these Macs have also got like ProRes decoders, they actually go into the video buffer mega fast. Now, the bigger or the faster that that video buffer is, the faster it can then feed the encoder as well. So basically, that's the reason why there was only a single piece of media in the timeline, and it was specifically ProRes. I mean, undoubtedly, if we were using like say uncompressed video and stuff like that, which doesn't require any kind of transcode into a video buffer, if it were the same kind of like attributes as the video buffer, then that too would also be the fastest way to kind of get into the video buffer. But at this time, what I've done here is to use something that we know is going to be like played out really fast from the timeline. And obviously that's because the ProRes accelerators decode as well as encode. Now at that point, what we're doing is pushing data into the encoders as fast as possible. Now at that point as well, these encoders are only going to have like a finite ceiling as to how quickly they're going to be able to process stuff. Now, I would actually imagine that if I were to have used a lower resolution timeline and also a lower frame rate even, what we would have seen there is quite possibly even faster results as well. However, I used 24p and 1080 as far as the resolution was concerned, because that's probably thereabouts kind of like the lowest kind of like frame rate and lowest resolution that your average person is probably going to be using for these types of things. So when we see this figure of like over 1,000 frames per second, that's because I'm able to feed into the video buffer as fast as possible from something that the actual system won't struggle to decode into the video buffer. Then at that that point, we're then feeding the encoder something that's really fast. Now, I'm going to actually hazard the guess here that what we seen there being like over 1,000 frames per second, I think we quite possibly were hitting the encoders for, or the encoder for as fast as it can possibly do that particular job. Like I say, if the timeline was lower resolution or lower frame rates and stuff like that, we might see an increase in the frame rate. However, that's proportionate to the amount of pixels being processed at any one time. Because don't forget, if that particular timeline wasn't 24 frames per second, but it was 48 frames per second, it would still have been the exact same amount of frames per second to do the encoding per second as far as the encoders were concerned. However, the time taken to do it would have been twice as long because there would have been twice as many frames in the timeline from 24 to 48. So it's really important to understand maybe 2 points here. How quickly you can send whatever is in the timeline to the main video buffer, and then how quickly you can then move that main video buffer to the encoder. And in this instance, because it was ProRes from beginning to end, that just helps us to move things through that path as fast as possible. Now, the other thing that I found very interesting here was the apparent lack of difference as far as the export times were concerned when using the variations of ProRes either as the source or the destination. So I was obviously changing from one form of ProRes to another, but on top of that, I was also going from one type of chroma subsampling to another type of chroma subsampling. Now, you could argue at this point that as far as the chroma subsampling is concerned, maybe the project itself just dictates that right the way through at 422. However, there's no denying the fact that the actual encode at the end will have been 4444 when that was chosen as the encode, and also on the input, that was also part of the input file. So whether or not there's a middle stage here which levels that out to 422, regardless of that, there was actually hard 4444 being encoded at the end. So the differences that were going on there, I actually thought were very interesting, because no way did any of these things slow any of the others down. And also on top of that, I was using Proxy to HQ up to 444XQ as well. And amongst all that, I would have thought possibly that the Proxy variant might have been a lot quicker or easier to have handled. However, it would appear that no matter what format you're using of like ProRes and the chroma subsampling, and probably to a degree maybe the bit depth as well, although that wasn't really tested in this particular test, but no matter what, it would appear that those actual ProRes encoders don't care what form of ProRes you're using. It just seems to do the same thing to all of it. Anyways, I think I will have covered the main two things I needed to have done here at the end, and that was doing a bit of explaining as to what was going on in the timeline, and also basically talking about how surprised I was by some of these results, which I'm fairly sure is going to be something that other people may have been surprised by as well. Now, there are other things I could go into right now, however I won't, because I will be doing other videos which are similar to this one, but also expanding upon how much more power we actually really get with an Ultra compared to a Max. So if you're into that type of stuff, defo keep an eye out on my channel, because there will be a bunch of other things coming up, and I can guarantee you there are some surprises as well. Anyways, I'm David Harry. Thank you very much for watching this video. Take care and goodbye now.